I'm here in London, in central London, in the office of Bill Browder, who runs a firm called Hermitage Capital. He is, of course, a fund manager and hedge fund manager, and has managed huge amounts of capital in Russia, and has also been a very active votary of the importance for good corporate governance standards in Russia, but lately of human rights. Can you tell me more about how human rights became important for you?
I started out just as a simple investor in Russia, buying shares, hoping that they went up instead of down in value.
Right.
Unfortunately, life in Russia is not so simple as that, and on a successive basis, I got sort of further dragged into really unpleasant situations, starting with theft inside the companies that we were investing in, which caused me to have to fight with the oligarchs. I started to expose that theft and that corruption, which led to me being expelled from Russia. I then had to get all of my people and all of our capital out of Russia after I was expelled from Russia. And then the police raided my offices in Moscow. They seized our documents. I hired a young lawyer to defend me in this raid. His name was Sergei Magnitsky.
Indeed.
And he discovered that the reason for the raid was the police, together working with a number of other corrupt officials and criminals, used all of the documents seized in the raid to steal $230 million of taxes that we paid. He testified about this tax crime, testified against a number of individuals. Some of those individuals came to his home, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, tortured him for 358 days, and then killed him more than 5 years ago, in November 2009. After he was killed, I became a human rights activist to get justice for him, and I've been focusing almost all of my time and energies on that.
One of the arguments you often hear is that it's enough for companies to have very good laws to protect investor capital and business. Human rights don't really matter. And one of the points that some of us have been making is that if a country does not respect human rights of its poor, at some point it will not respect the human rights of the rich. Is this a warning about all emerging markets? Is this why we should be worried about China, for example, where also there are cases of businessmen being taken to jail and not coming out for years?
In any country and situation where you have a weak rule of law, or where you have a non-democratic system where if somebody is doing a bad job governing, they can't be kicked out by their people, it lends itself to situations where human rights affects everybody. And it's naive and very stupid to think that you can go into countries with bad rule of law as a businessman and be able to come out okay. I know many stories in many different countries, not just Russia, where in these supposed developing economies where they have bad rule of law, that people end up with all sorts of terrible financial problems, and even worse, sometimes people get falsely arrested and other terrible.
And it also works the other way. In some countries where bankruptcy laws are used to bankrupt opposition leaders, in a way. I mean, in Southeast Asia, that's a common trend.
Well, and what that means is that the rule of law doesn't work. If laws can be abused, if judges don't rule fairly. And so the hallmark or the structure of any good market is one where people can't abuse the laws for their own purpose, where justice is independent and where judges are not corrupt. And if you have politically motivated judicial decisions, then anyone can get into trouble, and it doesn't matter whether you're the poorest person or the richest person in that country.
So in that context, is it a good idea to think about a potential alliance from business on one side and civil society on the other? Because the assumption people make is that if you're from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, you're by definition against power and therefore business. And business tends to see NGOs and human rights organizations as a hindrance, as a problem, rather than as an ally.
I have a very negative view of business, having come from the business world, that almost every businessman that I know would gladly sell human rights and justice down the river in a second for more money.
Until it affects them.
Until it affects them.
Right.
And so I used to have lots of friends in the business world. Now I don't have so many, because so many of the people I was rubbing shoulders with see my campaign for justice and sanctions against Russian officials as a potential business liability to themselves. I think the only way this can be fixed is if there is a cost to ignoring human rights. In other words, now most American companies would be very uncomfortable in getting involved in anything to do with bribery because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in America. If they were in any way involved or supporting human rights abuses, they should have there should be a similar consequence to Western companies. If you did that, and no one is going to behave themselves out of their goodwill, they'll behave themselves out of either profit maximization or loss
Compliance issues,
or
yeah.
loss minimization. It's not going to come from any other point, and in fact, nor should it. I mean, people are elected by their shareholders to maximize profits, and so it should be come into the profit line, human rights, or I should say, come into the loss line if they in any way support this type of.
The big issue in America is, of course, this backlash against tort law cases on human rights grounds, suing Shell for what happened in Nigeria or BP for what happened in Colombia or Freeport-McMoRan over Indonesia, just as hypothetical examples here. Is that the way forward to get companies to take it more seriously, as against moral arguments that are often made?
Well, the moral arguments don't work. So the sort of vexatious litigation by private plaintiffs in America, it doesn't work either.
Right.
But something along the lines of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where the government can prosecute companies who are misbehaving or neglecting human rights or actively involved in human rights abuses. I think that would be a very useful way of getting people to behave themselves. You don't want to hold people to blackmail the way that some of these alien tort types of laws are being used. But if you can come up with a way where the government has the opportunity to prosecute, then it might work better.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.